Realm presents Ninth Step Murders, Season 2, Episode 10.
After hours, the peacekeeper station at the edge of divided Tokyo could be quiet, or it could be downright eerie, depending on the weather. Today, despite everything that had happened over the past 48 hours, or perhaps because of it, the station was as tense as the eye of a storm. Somewhat poetically, the weather had obliged, and it had begun to rain. Charles Yardley had hoped to get some work done after everyone else went home and the mood eased. With the eternal thorn in his side, Emma Higashi, effectively neutralized in what Charles thought of as a brilliant outmaneuver, he spread before him the data for his next move. He'd taken the data key she'd tried to implicate him with and reworked the material so that it looked like Emma herself was responsible for Kobayashi's death. He'd poured himself a small glass from the Yamakaze sherry cask, 2013, that his grandfather had given to him on his first posting, and he sipped at it as he looked over his plans. He should have been in his element, and yet Charles still had to force himself not to jump at each sound. The former hotel wasn't known for good soundproofing, and it leaked more and more with every rainfall. Tonight, the drip, pause, drip of rain coming indoors set Charles's teeth on edge. But what was even worse was the wobbling squeak of wheels in the hallway, when everyone had supposedly gone home.
Maintenance crew,
he rationalized.
Who else would work late on a Friday night?
He turned back to the details of the tech mods he'd ordered, and relaxed again as he heard the hum of several vacuum drones being deployed. Who indeed? Charles splayed a copy of the local police station's murder map across his desk and smiled. The Nakajima Kai and the Resistance had been busy bloodily one-upping each other, and even though they'd sworn to stop, that could easily be rendered a temporary condition. Meantime, the Resistance was planning something. Tokyo was unsettled. Time to put the next part of his plan into... The door to Charles's outer office squeaked open. He looked, but saw no one. A vacuum drone hummed.
Still working. Come back later,
Charles said in Japanese, with an added emphasis to indicate extreme annoyance. The drone played a few notes of acknowledgement. Good. The vacuum drones fired up again down the hall, and Charles drained the rest of his glass too quickly. Not good. In order to refocus, he took his father's antique Smith & Wesson .45 from the drawer and put it on the desk, rubbing his thumb against the textured grip. The soft smell of gun oil in his nostrils brought back so many memories of his father and grandfather, and of their Texas vacation ranch, where Charles had first learned to shoot.
We're not cowboys, Charlie,
his father had warned him straight off.
Don't take your gun out unless you plan to use it. Leave the safety on. Always have an out.
Charles Yardley III knew that having this gun here, undeclared, was in itself an international violation of weapons agreements. But he also knew now that he could get away with just about anything. He gave the gun one more pat, and prepared to put it back in the desk drawer when a strong grip clamped down on his shoulder. Another hand, holding a police baton, pressed his palm against the gun grip, painfully. Yardley looked up into Police Inspector Miyako Koreda's glare.
No,
he chuckled.
Let's not be hasty. She had it coming.
Koreda blinked angrily, which gave Yardley enough time to get a better grip on the gun, should it come to that.
You, she began. You betrayed Emma. You got Minister Kobayashi killed. The Nakajima Kai too.
Yardley considered himself a lot of things. Connector, statesman, nation builder. Murderer seemed very minimalist.
Don't be crass, Koreda-san. Besides, that's old news.
He'd thought she'd come here to talk about Emma, which was not such old news. Miyako didn't blink. Her lip curled in barely controlled disgust.
You do not deserve to be here. In Tokyo. You defile it. You treat it like a toy. You make everything worse.
Her voice shook, and she pressed harder on the baton. Yardley's fingers began to throb.
Something must have set you off, Inspector Koreda. What is it? Your partner being a traitor? Your country falling to pieces? Your little love dove in trouble over the border?
Kaori?
Miyako's eyes flew wide at that, and her grip slipped on the baton.
You leave her out of this. Better yet, just leave.
Charles laughed as he pulled the gun free. Silence held the room still as he drew down on the inspector.
Honestly, what an amateur. I have no intention of quitting while I'm ahead.
But as he did so, Miyako changed her stance. Shoulders back, chin up. He could hear her breath coming fast and sharp. Despite her obvious upset, she gathered around herself a base of such controlled anger that Yardley's sense of triumph ebbed. He flipped the safety on the Smith & Wesson. The inspector's eyebrows rose a millimeter.
If you shoot a Tokyo police inspector, who'll take the fall for you this time, Yardley? The cleaning crew?
She did have a point.
I'll figure it out later. I always do.
At his words, the inspector drew a ragged breath. Good. Charles grinned. But as he did so, Miyako's hand flashed out and caught his arm, near the elbow. Her other arm bracketed the back of his neck with the baton. A modified shoulder capture, with an elbow hold. A judo move. He'd forgotten she'd once been good at that. A mistake on his part. Not an unrecoverable one. As Miyako immobilized him, Charles tried aiming the gun at her again, and she let him, momentarily. Then she continued the motion, bending his arm until the Smith & Wesson was facing him directly. He'd miscalculated again. As he stared down the blunt-nosed barrel of his grandfather's gun, Charles tasted the bitter revenant of the whiskey at the back of his mouth. It was him or her. But what Charles knew already, that Miyako hadn't yet understood, was that it was never him.
Fine, Inspector. How much do you want?
He succeeded in keeping his voice level. Maybe he could insult her out of the office, or at least out of the grip. Miyako gasped.
How dare you?
Because I can,
he said, and tried to wrench his hand away, but Miyako's grip was too strong.
Not this time,
she said, as he continued to struggle. Her voice broke, all the anger she felt pushing her next words fast.
You don't get another chance, Yardley, to hurt anyone else.
Yardley was certain his death would be grandly heroic, or at least respectable, not a dark office with cleaning crews buzzing in the hallway. That was no way to go out. And there was no chance Inspector Koreda had the guts to do it anyway. You wouldn't dare, Yardley thought, but didn't say. But then, Miyako breathed out and squeezed the trigger. 24 hours earlier. Emma sipped her beer as she sat in the heavily padded booth seat at the one-note karaoke bar. Kensuke and Nishimura had the mics, and were busy tearing up one of the 5-year-old pop hits from a New Zealand boy band. They were pretty good at this one, she had to admit. A disco ball spun above, throwing mirror sparkles around the ceiling and floor. The beer tasted fine. Emma nodded at her fellow officers, clapped when they performed. She wasn't ready to sing yet. The rest of the division was at the bar too, watching and singing. So was Ren. The Nakajima Kai rep sat on the edge of his seat, pawing through the songs. He hadn't found anything he liked. It had been Nishimura's idea to get him to come out with the station, to try and heal some of the tension that had sprung up during the drone assassination case. Emma didn't love the idea. But after waiting for 2 days for an official U.S. government response to her message, she was going stir-crazy. Whether Ren was there or not, stepping away from her work obligations did feel good. She took another long pull on the beer. She'd expected the diplomats to contact her by now. That was good intel on the chip she'd put in the drop box, definitively showing that Charles Yardley was trying to run his own operation in Tokyo, including actions that were diametrically opposed to his country's policies. He should be already on a plane back to D.C. Emma allowed herself a small, tight smile at the thought. But so far, that hadn't happened. Yardley was still lurking in his office. Maybe she should have hand-delivered the data, despite the risks. If she didn't hear anything by tomorrow, she'd try approaching McDowell again. She was done waiting. Miyako slid into the padded booth just as Nishimura hit a high note and held it for an amazingly long time. "Hey," she said. Her face sparkled with mirror reflections. "Hey," Emma answered. They hadn't really talked since she'd told Miyako she was meeting with the Nakajima Kai. She'd talked Ueda out of that forsaken data key, and then turned it over, she thought, to the embassy, without saying any more. That was her own fault. Emma had wanted to be able to tell her partner that Yardley was gone. His games ended. Instead, she still had no answers. They occupied the booth separately, dividing it with their silence. Finally, Miyako spoke. "Seems like the murder map is slowing its growth at least today. That's kind of a relief." She was trying to reach out. Through all her worries, Emma was glad for it. "Even the revenge biz seems to have died down for a bit," Emma deadpanned, and Miyako groaned. "You two going to sing or what?" Kensuke smiled, although it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll pick out a song for you." "No thanks, we'll pick our own songs," Emma answered. It was funny. The longer she was in Tokyo, the easier it was to banter, even when she was on edge. Sometimes it was even easier with Kensuke, now that he was clear about everything. But singing was never going to get easier. She turned to Miyako, ready to cede the song choice to her partner, just as the door opened. 2 of the officers who'd been coming on shift when Nishimura had dragged them all to the one note entered, batons drawn.
"What is the meaning of this interruption?"
Nishimura's voice made the room shake. The disco ball still spun. The lyrics scrolled past, unsung. The station chief winced and moved the microphone farther away from his mouth.
"We are here,"
one of the officers said,
"to place Emma Higashi under arrest."
"What?" Miyako stood, jostling the table and knocking over Emma's beer. The golden liquid formed a puddle on the table that began to drip to the floor. Emma looked at the officer, curious. "That's ridiculous," she finally said. "What is the charge?" The officers didn't answer her. Instead, they turned to Nishimura, whose sleeve was flashing. Then Miyako's and Kensuke's began lighting up as well. Emma looked and saw her face emblazoned on each screen.
"Assassin responsible for the minister's death. To be captured by the Tokyo police, with the support of peacekeepers and U.S. government."
"That's not correct," Emma breathed. She'd sent the chip to McDowell, her new peacekeeper boss, using the biometrically secure drop locker. He'd told her before she didn't have the proof. The chip made it clear exactly who had been talking to Kobayashi, exactly who was responsible for the assassination. Yardley, not Emma. That chip was the proof. She'd gotten it. They should be arresting Yardley, not her. Emma's ears filled with static. This couldn't be happening. Unless... had Ueda's information been a Trojan horse? Had he been trying to get her out of the way? That didn't make sense. Or was McDowell in on everything? In league with Charles? That didn't make sense either. Suddenly, nothing made sense. The disco ball spun. Miyako and Kensuke stared at Emma. Then the officers. And slowly, Nishimura nodded. As if released from a spell, the officers stepped forward and removed Emma's weapons and sleeve. For a moment, Emma closed her eyes protectively. If they were going to fully disarm her, in front of everyone, it would be ugly. But they didn't. Instead, they took her hands and bound them behind her back. The arresting officers didn't know what her modded eye could do. No one had told them. And Miyako, Kensuke, and Nishimura weren't telling them now. That was something. Emma let them lead her out of the bar. As they walked her to the elevator, she heard Miyako's chosen song begin to play, muffled, from inside the booth.
We'll get to the bottom of this,
Miyako shouted.
Emma, I promise.
Despite the reprieve, Emma's head was spinning. The bottom? That was where Yardley lived, like a snake in a well. She thought she'd been able to get rid of him. And somehow, how? He'd turned the tables on her. Or someone had. But who? And what was she going to do now? Nishimura and Miyako followed behind, carrying her things. The 9th Step Station officers led her out of the building where the karaoke bar was, and down the street, into the rain. In plain view of all the buildings. Emma could feel the drones overhead, gathering data. She could sense cameras taking in her image. Her skin prickled. Her face, the handcuffs, the officers, all of it would be pasted across the feeds and screens of Tokyo. By the time she was led into the station, her face was all over the walls. Emma felt sick to her stomach with shame, even though she knew she was innocent. The officers led her down the hallway and opened the door to an interrogation cell, instead of taking her to holding. Maybe she wouldn't have to be there long. But Miyako followed with a cushion and a blanket.
We'll get this figured out,
she promised. Then the officers began to usher everyone out.
But first, paperwork.
Miyako rolled her eyes, trying to make light of the situation. Emma, holding the blanket and cushion, had a hard time smiling back at her partner. The last time she'd been in an interrogation room, Emma had been on the other side of the desk. At least it was quiet in here. For now. If the officers started an interrogation, it wouldn't be quiet for long. But the arresting officers didn't try to interrogate her. They left with Miyako. When the door closed, Emma slumped to the floor, eyes closed tight. "Fuck you, Yardley," she whispered. The next morning, Nishimura carried a mug, Emma's own weaponized pony mug, the one with the unicorn, into the interrogation cell. When she saw him standing there at the door, Emma rose from the floor where she'd slept, trying to rub the sleep out of her eyes. She gestured for him to enter. Nishimura put the mug on the table and pushed it toward her. She smelled tea.
"You're going to tell me you're innocent,"
he said. It wasn't a question. Emma nodded anyway.
"I am innocent."
She wanted to tell Nishimura about Ueda, about Yardley. She didn't have the chance. Nishimura sighed and placed his hands palms up on the table in a gesture so unlike him, Emma drew a sharp breath.
"And I am going to have to tell you that it doesn't matter. Not right now."
She closed her eyes against exhaustion and anger.
"Why not?"
"Because,"
her boss said.
Things are complicated.
Things. Politics. That was what Nishimura meant. She shivered. Was McDowell part of the complications? Or Nishimura himself? Who could she turn to for help if that was the case? She sat down in the chair he'd pulled out for her. Play it straight until you know more, Emma. Tell me about it, boss. I'm on the wrong side of an interrogation room table. And I have questions. Complicated ones.
Ask.
Nishimura's voice was frustrated, but kind. Maybe he was still on her side. What do you know? He spread his sleeve on the table so that Emma could see his entire display.
Your peacekeepers have turned over data files to the Diet and the police that indicate you helped coordinate the attack on the minister. There's also indication that you helped move weapons stolen from the port several months ago. It's all authenticated.
Emma groaned. Nishimura continued.
Is there anyone you can think of who might have tampered with or altered digital evidence?
There was, in fact, exactly one person Emma could think of. Nishimura seemed to read her mind.
Your friend, Charles Yardley.
He's not my friend. And if Emma admitted where she'd gotten the original data chip, Nishimura would never trust her again. She bit her lip. And he would totally alter digital evidence. Has Miyako seen the data? Nishimura nodded.
She didn't believe it was real either.
She leaned back in her chair. But, with a slight incline of his head, Nishimura acknowledged the prison of that word. Emma stood up, then began to pace. She glanced at the closed door, then at her boss. I am no good to anyone in here. I can't see anything. I can't fix anything.
I know,
he said softly.
But for now, you here means no one can catch you out there. The news already has the story. Both governments are outraged. Everyone wants to make you an example.
He tapped his sleeve to show multiple feed captures. Chirons sped across the screens. Her name, chased by inexplicable words. Dereliction of duty. Betrayal. Possible court-martial. A high-ranking peacekeeper with more bars on his chest than Emma had ever seen on station was denying any involvement. Plausibly. The whole works. Yardley wasn't leaving anything to chance. And the Nakajima-kai? If they were furious with her too, Emma really didn't have anyone to help her.
Haven't heard a word.
Where's Miyako? Maybe her partner could get a message too. Emma tried to think of anyone who might have her back at the Peacekeepers' barracks now. Since her reassignment, she'd grown distant from so many people. That distance was something Charles had relied on, for certain. But what about someone at Ninth Step? One of the data miners here? Sasaki? Maybe. If Miyako talked to them, maybe there was a way to prise the fake data away from the real. Maybe... Emma's mind whirled.
Inspector Koreda's on a case.
Nishimura's expression gave nothing away.
But there is someone who would like to help you.
He gestured to the door of the interrogation cell and cleared his throat. The door swung open with a screech. Kensuke stuck his head inside.
Hi, Emma.
The newscaster's voice was white static in Miyako's ear. Crackdowns, resistance action, power outages. The comforting hum that let her know nothing had happened in the city overnight, that everything was fine, gone. Once she'd found the news comforting, now she turned her earbud to music. One of Kaori's favorite songs, on repeat. Everything was not fine. She pushed the car to accelerate, and it buzzed at her.
Authorized speed exceeded.
Miyako cursed. But she let the car drive and thought back to the conversation she'd had moments before she left the station. Sasaki, the data miner, had appeared with a document.
I found the information Inspector Higashi was asking for. Is further assistance needed?
The document was a blank. Miyako knew Emma hadn't requested any information lately. She blinked, then composed herself. Thank you. Yes, I may have more questions. Ever since Miyako and Emma had cracked her cold case, the data miner had been on standby, offering to help with anything the police inspectors needed. Miyako sometimes wondered if she listened to intakes. Now she had proof. The data miner was worried about Emma. There's a data file circulating.
I've seen it.
Sasaki's voice was steady. It gave away nothing. Could you... Miyako didn't want to ask anything that would get the woman in trouble.
Pull it apart? Already working on it. Anything else?
Just let me know if you find something. I know Emma. This isn't like her.
When?
What?
When I find something, not if. I'll let you know.
The data miner disappeared. Miyako slowly let her breath out in the car, thinking about the barely contained anger of those words. She knew the feeling. One thing was for certain. Whoever did this was going to pay. The squad car pulled up to the club where Miyako was supposed to meet Ueda, the head of the Nakajimakai. She had questions for him, too. But she waited a moment, looking at the building, thinking. Kaori had said biggest job ever, the last time they spoke. What had she meant? Miyako rested her head on the dashboard. The plastic felt cool in the city's already humid heat. A whole lot of things were going wrong, all at the same time, as if someone had planned it that way. Was that the Resistance's doing? Part of the biggest job ever? Or was there someone else pulling strings? Someone who wanted her and Emma out of commission. Someone who wanted the eyes of Tokyo to be turned away for a moment, so that... What? What could happen? Ueda. She eyed the door of the warehouse club. The night the power tanker exploded, Miyako guessed, the Resistance had taken the general disarray to assemble another part of their bigger plan. But had the Nakajimakai taken advantage too? When the crackdowns started, it had been all about the Resistance. Then the murders had pitted both groups against each other. Everything that happened had led to something bigger and more dangerous. She recalled the heat from the explosion, the look in Kaori's eyes, her own fear and worry. She remembered with a shiver the miniature drones from the reprisals, the damage they left on both Resistance and Nakajimakai bodies. Whatever this next move was, what would it bring with it? More danger, certainly. More disturbances. More places to take advantage. Meanwhile, someone, somewhere, was slowly and carefully pulling all of Tokyo's support networks apart, destabilizing the police, infrastructure, the tenuous relationship between the Nakajimakai and the Resistance. Divide and conquer. There were a few groups who would benefit from this kind of turmoil. The Nakajimakai themselves, likely. They always seemed to. The Chinese, perhaps. And the Americans, because turmoil was job security. Miyako grimaced. That wasn't a nice way to think about the peacekeepers. Even Emma. But there was someone else. Yardley. For so long, Miyako had hesitated to think of him at all. But Emma had suspected him. More than that, Emma had straight up told her he'd killed Kobayashi. And she'd been trying to get information. Enough to accuse him publicly. But Yardley? He was powerful enough that the same rules which bound Emma also applied to Miyako. No matter what she thought she knew, she could only accuse him, and only through proper channels, if she had overwhelming evidence. Emma had gotten evidence. Now Miyako would get some too. Miyako opened the car door and stepped into the heat. She walked up to the warehouse club. When she pulled the door open, music pulsed out onto the street. In waves of electric noise, Miyako shuddered as first her earbud and then her sleeve lost signal. Time for another meeting. This one, hopefully, would help her get what she needed. Inside the red-lit club, Miyako pushed past a few early clients. Or from the looks of them, maybe extremely late ones. As she walked deeper into the shadows, she could make out a man in a suit passed out on a sofa. A woman wearing a cleaning uniform carefully put glassware on a cart. An elderly man mopped the floor. Somewhere, deep in that darkness, surrounded by security drones, Ueda waited for her. He was taking no risks, especially now.
The Resistance has called off their attacks.
Miyako murmured to the air. You are not in danger.
Prove it.
A voice whispered at her ear. Miyako swatted and a tiny drone fell to the ground. She crushed the carbon fiber carapace, still whispering, under her foot.
Time is the only proof. Trust me or don't.
She said it like she would to a witness. She hoped he was just a witness. A small light hovered in front of her. Red, like the rest of the club. But this one was tiny and focused. It danced a path through the shadows, to a doorway, and then, when that door opened, bobbed through it. Miyako followed. In a small windowless room lined with video screens, Ueda sat in a padded chair, watching the divided city. A spider in a web.
Haven't you seen the news?
I don't watch the news. I make the news. I watch the city.
He intoned. Miyako gritted her teeth. He hadn't seen. Fine. No time to waste.
You gave my partner a file, and it got her in trouble.
She began. Ueda opened his mouth to deny everything. Shut it. Then folded his hands on his lap.
That's impossible.
Check the news feed.
Ueda grumbled, but flicked a finger and the screen closest to him showed Emma, cuffed, being led into Ninth Step Station.
Your partner was obviously naive. She could have exposed me.
Ueda said, angrily.
To whom?
The Nakajimakai boss shook his head. Miyako couldn't be sure, but it seemed, for the first time, as if the crime boss was afraid.
I cannot help you. You must leave.
Not until you tell me something that helps me help my friend.
Miyako's voice rose and broke on the final word. Ueda paused.
He thinks he has everyone's number. The Resistance, the Peacekeepers, your friend. He likes to set different groups against each other, to see who is strongest. Like toys, a rich man's toys. But Yardley doesn't care what happens to these toys, to any of us. He'll just get new ones when he breaks these. You should walk away.
Miyako's chin lifted and she stared at the Nakajimakai, unblinking.
No.
The door opened, and 2 more red lights stood by to escort her out. When she protested, one turned and drew a bead of bright light over her heart. Miyako moved. Back in the squad car, Miyako sat staring at the warehouse. She was about to tell the car to start, to take her back to the station, when a librarian icon appeared on her dashboard.
I have an answer to your question, I think.
Sasaki, the data miner.
Show me. On my sleeve.
A file opened on Miyako's data sleeve. The data miner's voice came through Miyako's sub-vocal system now. Sasaki was smart, and aware that the car was likely bugged.
These are the items used to implicate Higashi. They've been modified several times. Once, almost a week ago, by a known associate of the Nakajima Kai, but the provenance on that data is still intact. Then, again yesterday.
By whom? Miyako murmured under her breath.
I can't tell. The signature is encrypted, but the location is not. The data was altered at the Peacekeeper base.
And what was altered? Miyako's self-control stretched to a thin edge.
It wasn't easy to see. The alteration was done at the bit level. Very good job. But the dates on each increment of data were wrong, and enough of a trace of the older data remained underneath. When I restored those, it revealed that the ownership of a temporary Tenmail account had been shifted to Emma Higashi from Charles Yardley.
And what did the files discuss?
With whom is more important. Kobayashi.
Thanks, Sayoke. Miyako started the car. She needed to return it to the station. Is there anything else?
Not yet. But Yardley's doing a whole lot of political spin now, trying to make sure Emma's out of commission for a long time. And he's casting doubt on the police's ability to prosecute.
Layers of news interviews appeared on Miyako's sleeve. Miyako chewed on her lip. Thank you. She took over manual controls and began to drive. Faster and faster. Headed for the Peacekeeper compound. This American. She'd stood before his desk the day she and Emma first met. He'd allowed her to think Emma was a secretary, just to yank both their strings. Ueda had it right. This man liked to play people like toys. He liked to play countries that way, too. A drop of rain hit the windshield. Then another. They skidded off the sides of the glass as Miyako hit the gas. As she forced the car to accelerate beyond acceptable speeds, Miyako swore she would make sure Yardley knew how it felt.
You can't be here,
Emma said to Kensuke.
I'm toxic. It will ruin your career, being seen with me.
She looked to her boss for aid, but Nishimura unhelpfully exited the interrogation room. Kensuke pulled up a chair. For once, he wasn't smiling or trying to flirt. He was dead serious. I don't care, Emma.
We're done. Over. I was just using you for
exercise. I gathered. It doesn't matter. I have a duty. A crime was committed in my city, and it affects someone I have, perhaps unwisely, grown to care about. Very much.
He looked at her, his eyes taking in her face. Emma was too angry to reply, even with courtesy.
Just let me out of here then. I'll fix Yardley.
You won't, but I can try. Besides, I need your help on a problem too. So you won't try to take this room apart piece by piece, sure. But more than that, I have to close this one. It's important.
Emma growled. She had been considering taking the room apart.
While I work your case, you help me figure out something about my case. Deal?
Kensuke didn't sound hopeful, but Emma inclined her head.
Okay. Word on the street is that the resistance is about to make a major move. With the Nakajima Kai war just settling, and the Chinese on high alert, we have to stop them. They're putting themselves in too much danger. They're putting Tokyo in danger. We've kept the mini-drone killings and the samurai drone reprisals from impacting the people of Tokyo so far. But if things grow too unstable, I can't guarantee that a lot of innocents won't get hurt. Figure out what the resistance is planning. Even Nishimura doesn't know. Help me stop them.
And in the meantime, you will?
Kensuke smiled, relieved.
Work with my contacts to figure out who gave you tainted files.
You think they were tainted when I got them?
Emma could imagine Ueda playing both sides like that. But that was Yardley's playground, too.
I'll find out. You work on this, okay?
Kensuke stood up to go. He left a data sleeve on the table. Fine. But hurry up. Emma grudgingly agreed as the door shut. It wasn't like she had a choice. But the clock was ticking. She'd been in jail nearly a whole day already, and she hated sleeping on the floor. She tapped at the sleeve. A folder on the resistance opened up. Cells. Actions. Someone had more data than they'd been sharing, but now, with a bigger action at risk, they'd given it to someone who could help. Emma paused. No, they'd given the data to someone who was now outside the system. She couldn't act. She couldn't tell anyone. She could only think, come up with ideas, dig deeper. She began to sort through the images from recent actions, looking for hints of what was to come, using her enhanced lenses. After an hour, she paused, staring at a drone shot, at the back of a dark room. In a crowd, she thought she saw Miyako's silhouette. What? No. It could be anyone. But Emma thought she knew her partner. Emma dove deeper into the Resistance's activities, looking for proof, searching for more images. There were none. Nothing clearer. Kensuke didn't return. Someone brought her water and food, but she didn't touch it. This had to be an accident. A mistake. Wrong place, wrong time. If it wasn't a mistake, Emma knew that someone at the department had been keeping a not-so-close watch on Inspector Koreeda, as well as others. Kensuke? Maybe. Or maybe they hadn't looked at that photo closely. She was using her eye, after all. Besides, all the data the station had led to small, unconnected cells. Kensuke had even declared defeat. So many faces. That one might not even be Miyako. But Emma knew it was. Still, there was no way to discern what any group was planning. Emma pushed the sleeve away. She stared at the wall. Miyako, what are you doing? She hoped that her friend knew. Now. Miyako burst from Charles's inner office, looking for somewhere to hide, at least until she could clean the blood from her face. She'd only meant to scare him, to let him know how it felt to be on the other side of the gun. No, she'd meant to do more. She'd allowed herself anger. When he'd threatened Kaori, when he'd betrayed Emma, when he'd tried to bribe her. She'd done this thing. She couldn't hide. She would not hide. She had to turn herself in. You can't. You can't. She whispered in the darkness of the former hotel. Down the hall, a herd of vacuum drones hummed loud enough that no one could hear anything else. She would turn herself in when she was done. And she wasn't done. She had to find Kaori before Yardley's plan took effect. Her ears rang. She shook her head to clear it. She had to go. Now. Now. Miyako dodged into the private bathroom connected to the office, not caring if peacekeeper cameras saw her. She grabbed paper towels and filled a basin with water. It took forever to get the blood off her face and her hair pinned back. Her makeshift bun was already crusty, but it didn't show in the light. Her hand ached where she'd gripped Yardley when the gun went off. She shook it, trying to wave away the pain, then dabbed at her uniform with the wet towel, grateful that the uniform was easy to clean. Then Miyako stuffed the towels into a bin and left. When she'd stepped away from the desk, Charles Yardley had been barely breathing in the office behind her. His hands weren't clean anymore. It looked, almost, like he'd shot himself. Except, behind the desk, the wall said something different. She would carry with her the image of that wall splattered with blood, an angry halo behind Charles's slumped form, and a nearly clean space where her body had blocked some of the spray. Miyako slipped off her uniform jacket and stuffed it into a cleaning drone's garbage sack headed for the incinerator. She took an elevator all the way down to the basement and ran through the maintenance hallways for the exit. Along the way, she grabbed a cleaner's coat from a hook in the break room and put that on. Then she was out of the building, walking carefully with a group of other cleaners going off shift, head down, away from the Peacekeeper sector. After a few streets, she turned left away from the group and began to run faster, heading for the Chinese border, the drone wall. Heading for Kaori. She'd seen the paperwork Charles had spread across his desk, plans for boosting the impact of electronic weapons so that any resistance action would look like full-on war. A way to throw everything into chaos again, no matter who died. That lack of caring was what had done it, what had made her angry beyond measure. Yardley's smirking tone when he'd called her crass, when he'd offered her money, when he'd said, "Because I can." The man had liked to pull strings. He'd been raised to do it. But this was the wrong string. Extreme power boosting, electronics interference, something big. The Resistance was going to use an EMP, and Kaori was going to be there. And Yardley had sabotaged it so that it would be worse than anyone expected. So Miyako would be there too. She kept running, though her breath began to saw at her lungs and her legs felt rubbery. She couldn't stop now. High above Tokyo, drones hovered, learning the city day and night, gathering data on every shift and change. The data they collected created a second city, one that was displayed on screens, in secret back rooms, even on murder maps. More drones flew lower, dividing the city from itself, forming the drone wall between Chinese-occupied Tokyo and Japanese-occupied Tokyo. These drones knew one thing: whether you were supposed to be outside or inside the wall. On the Japanese side of the drone wall, power flickered. A few streets faded, then shone again. The Peacekeeper base and U.S. Embassy, which operated on generator-fed LEDs, shone like a blue diamond amidst amber and topaz lights behind Miyako's fleeing form. On the Chinese side, the lights shone brighter. The AC fans on rooftops ran louder. A door opened on the Japanese side, and a shop owner stepped onto the street, trying to see if it was his building that was flickering, or the whole neighborhood. "What's the problem?" someone called from above.
It's another day in divided Tokyo,
The businessman replied.
Miss,
He called back.
does anyone know what the problem is? Why do we get the bad electricity when they
He pointed across the drone wall.
get the good stuff?
Miyako sped past them. No time to answer. She had to get a message to the Resistance on the Chinese side, to tell them to wait. Something big, Kaori had said. But she wasn't privy to what. The plans on Charles Yardley's desk, now splattered with his blood. Miyako sped on. Then, as if someone hit a switch, half of Tokyo fell dark. The Chinese half. The businessman stared from the Japanese half of the street. Miyako didn't stop running. She might still be able to help. The air conditioners went silent. Darkness fell. Tokyo, all of it now, disappeared into the night. In the silent dark, Miyako couldn't see. Her heart raced, and then she couldn't breathe either. For a moment she was back in the war, caught in a shelter as the fighting grew louder and did not quiet for days. It was so utterly dark. She whimpered. This was what the war had felt like. That silence before everything went down. But this was not the war. This was the after. Trying to gather herself, Miyako turned her earbud back to the news channel. But the earbud threw silence at her. Dead. Even Miyako's police issue sleeve was blanked, and that was supposed to be EMP-proof. More people began coming out on the streets, on both sides of the city. Some tried to take photos with their sleeves, but their sleeves were blank. Some just stared up at the only lights still out there. The drones and the stars above the drones. Each a small pinprick in the black. Everything around her felt like a held breath, as if the city was thinking about what to do next. And then, near Miyako, one tiny click, soft as a raindrop. A small carbon fiber carapace hit the pavement. Another few rattled down. A tiny casualty. Then a few more fell, this time striking cars. A sharp edge caught Miyako's cheek, drawing blood. Her own this time. Someone shrieked. A child began calling for its mother. A shop owner shouted angrily, "The drones!" Miyako gasped, then kept running, not realizing when she crossed into the Chinese side, because suddenly, all around her, drones fell like a summer storm. With the sound of thousands of metal, plastic, and carbon fiber bodies striking streets and signposts, windows and cars, the entire border wall dropped to the ground. Too late. She was too late. Miyako's chest ached. For a moment, the street fell silent again. People filled both sides of the street. And in the middle of the street, too. In Chinese-occupied and Japanese Tokyo, they stared at each other. Now that no drones gathered data from above, no drone wall separated them, for a moment, they were one city. The only city. Unified in the darkness. Then the sound of running feet replaced that of falling drones. The darkness echoed with motion, and more shouts. Glass shattered in the distance. Miyako kept moving. She would go to the apartment. She'd find Kaori. A police whistle sounded. Not a Japanese whistle. By reflex, Miyako froze beneath a darkened streetlight. 2 Chinese policemen grabbed her.
"Where are your crossing papers?"
When she could produce none, they cuffed her, then pulled her into their vehicle.
Get your hands off me!
She shouted, but it did no good. Emma's interrogation cell door opened again, but this time it stayed open. The hallway outside was dim, flickering as if the lights were being run by a generator. The interrogation room's walls were thick. They'd insulated her from everything that had happened overnight. If there had been a blackout, Emma hadn't heard a thing. She looked up, expecting to see Kensuke again. Instead, she met Nishimura's eyes as he came through the doorway. Quickly, she adjusted the focus on her eye so she didn't catch him so close up. Not noticing, he gestured to her to leave her table. To stand.
"You have to come. Now."
"I thought things were she began. But when she saw his expression shift from bureaucratic concern to something else entirely, she stopped. What happened?
"Your friend, Yardley."
Nishimura's normal, taciturn expression looked even more grim.
What about him?
"He's not my friend," she added silently.
"Someone shot him."
"Dead?" Emma squelched a moment of hope. That wasn't professional. Nishimura shook his head.
"Intensive care."
The assassination market? Emma wondered, but didn't say.
Well, I was here. You can prove that.
Everyone knows you were. You're not on the hook for that. We've also given the Peacekeepers some data that will clear your name. Courtesy of Sasaki.
Emma didn't feel like this was all he had to tell her.
So you're letting me go?
Her boss didn't answer.
The Resistance executed its plan to EMP particular portions of the Chinese side, sometime after Yardley was shot, but somehow their equipment overclocked. They took out all the power, dropped the drone wall. The Chinese are massing forces to re-insulate the boundary, and arresting anyone who's caught on their side. Meantime, there are wounded out there because of the blast, because of the disarray. Someone stood to benefit from that disaster. The power's come back on now. So we're getting messages, requests for assistance.
And Yardley?
We think he boosted the EMP. Peacekeepers are denying it. Everyone's staring each other down at the highest levels.
And you need me to help?
Not officially.
He paused, weighing his next words.
What then?
Miyako. Her last signal put her near the drone wall when it fell. She's not responding.
Emma frowned. That wasn't like Miyako at all. Then again, Miyako had been unlike Miyako for a while. But no one had mentioned the photos yet. No one had acknowledged anything. Maybe they hadn't seen them, or hadn't seen Miyako in them. She put her hands on the data sleeve Kensuke left.
Tell me what you really need.
Nishimura sighed.
There are some resistance factors, on both sides of the drone wall. It's very dangerous. Please, Emma, you have to find her. You know where she'd go if she thought she was in danger.
Kaori. She'd find Kaori, Emma thought. And no one she works with knows who that is. Just me. She gave a brief nod.
But why me?
As soon as she asked it, Nishimura winced. He didn't answer. That was all the answer Emma needed.
Because I'm still complicated. Only now it's convenient to have me outside, rather than inside. Now maybe no one wants me. I'm inconvenient to too many people. And useful, too.
Nishimura gave a long, regretful nod.
You can say I escaped if you have to. During the confusion.
She decided to let him off the hook. A little bit. But Nishimura reached out and clasped her arm.
You're an excellent cop, Emma. Someone I'd want on my side anytime. And you're the only one I trust to find her before the Chinese do.
Emma took a deep breath and squeezed Nishimura's hand.
I'm the only one I trust to find her, too.
As she headed out of Ninth Step Station, without a badge or any insignia, Emma Higashi realized that, for the first time in nearly forever, she was not official, not on duty, but she was still here to help. She blinked and brought her enhanced eye fully online. She was going to help.
You're listening to Ninth Step Murders Season 2. Created and produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Listen away. Ninth Step Murders is written by Malka Older, Fran Wilde, Jacqueline Koyanagi, and Curtis C. Chen. Produced by Rhoda Bayesa and executive produced by Molly Barton. Performed by Emily Wu Zeller. Audio production, direction, sound design, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith. Additional editing by Corey Barton. Cover design by Kendall Thomas, with original illustration by Armin Rangati.